Christians stop proclaiming themselves as loyal citizens of the Byzantine state. Up until the early years of the Abbasid period, in the mosaic floors, they continue to date their mosaic floors by the Byzantine dating system of the Byzantine provinces that were in use throughout the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries. It's only after the Abbasid Revolution that the Christians stop using Byzantine dates and they use a more religiously neutral creation of the world era that is no longer proclaiming themselves as citizens of the Byzantine Empire as late as 756. All of the later mosaics use this neutral era of their creation of the world. And I'm inclined to think that this choice of the Christians to no longer be loyal Byzantine citizens is somehow connected with the choice of the Christians and the Jews as well to get rid of their images, perhaps in response to a hardening attitude of the Abbasid authorities against the non-Muslim population. But this is all speculation, as so many other issues involved with this episode of deliberate damage. You can sort of see what they're doing, but understanding why, in the absence of any great useful literary source, remains a speculation. But I think it's an event of the early Abbasid period in response to Muslim governmental policy, but then maybe it isn't. Well, anyway, questions that I don't think I'll ever be able to solve myself, and something maybe somebody in the future will be able to figure out better than I have. Well, so thank you for your attention.
As you can see, many things in this exhibition are still open for discussion and debates and new evidence being revealed. And Arnold Franklin of Queens College is one of the people leading into a new generation of scholarship, particularly on Judaica, and will soon publish This Noble House, Jewish Descendants of King David in the Medieval Islamic East, with focus on the profound concern with genealogy, which leads him, of course, to the Cairo Geniza documents, which we are increasingly using not only for the studies of issues dealing with Jewish history, but of the history of the region and for all of the people there. So we're very excited to welcome Professor Franklin.
Before I start, let me just say thank you to Helen Evans and to her staff and to the Metropolitan Museum for organizing this stimulating symposium. I also want to express my admiration for the excellent job they did in organizing this very timely and important exhibition. A number of the items in the Byzantium and Islam exhibition come from a source that, while familiar at least in name to specialists, still remains something of an unknown quantity even to the most well-educated of laymen. I'm referring to the unique trove of Jewish manuscripts known as the Cairo Geniza, which first came to the attention of the scholarly community a little over a century ago. Today, I will address the Geniza's relevance to what I think is one of the core themes of the new exhibition, namely the exchange of goods and ideas between confessional or religious communities. Along the way, I'll also introduce you to some interesting items that you won't see in the exhibition, but which I think extend and deepen issues raised by it. While the Geniza materials, as we will see, are a bit later, chronologically speaking, than most of the items in the exhibition, they are nonetheless very much a significant byproduct of the 7th to 9th century world that it portrays. Let's begin just by clarifying what a Geniza is and what makes the Cairo Geniza such a special one. According to an ancient Jewish taboo that is still observed by some today, writings of a religious nature that have become damaged, worn out, or otherwise unusable must not be discarded with ordinary refuse, but instead are to be disposed of in a respectful manner, in a way commensurate with their intrinsic sanctity. Of particular concern was avoiding the desecration of God's name, which things like Torah scrolls, prayer books, etc., tend to contain in prodigious quantities. The term geniza is used in two senses. It describes the practice of appropriately hiding away or concealing religious texts, as well as the site or receptacle in which such writings were eventually consigned. While local communities followed a variety of practices, most often the custom of geniza was observed by burying the writings in a cemetery, much as one would solemnly inter a human body. The Cairo geniza is perhaps the most renowned example we have of this ancient custom's implementation. It is the historian's good fortune that it is also a most atypical geniza. We can be certain that the Jewish communities of Egypt knew of the more conventional practice of burying discarded sacred texts. But for reasons that still remain obscure, over the course of centuries, the Jews of Fustat and Cairo preferred to dispose of their sacred writings in an above-ground storage room in a local house of worship, a site today known as the Ben Ezra Synagogue, but in the Middle Ages as the Synagogue of the Jerusalemites or the Synagogue of the Palestinians. And here you see a photograph from the upstairs balcony of the synagogue. In one way or another, it was in continuous use by Egypt's Jewish community from the 11th century on, which in and of itself is really quite remarkable. It was renovated several times, most recently in 1991, a few years before this photograph was taken. And here we see a photograph of the entrance to the chamber itself where the manuscripts were accumulated, which was located in the upstairs balcony. The significance of the decision to create a geniza indoors cannot be overstated. Kept in a sealed, dark room and exposed only to Egypt's desiccating climate, the mostly paper documents were given an infinitely better chance of survival than they would have been had they been subjected to the damp soil as prevailing custom dictated. There is a second reason that the Cairo geniza stands out as a unique collection, and that has to do with the kinds of materials that were deposited in it. As we might expect, it contained in great abundance pages from biblical texts, rabbinic works, liturgical pieces, and writings of a mystical or speculative nature, some of which were virtually unknown before the geniza's discovery. But in addition to these, and again for reasons that are not entirely clear, the Jews of medieval Fustat and Cairo also relegated to their geniza writings that we might characterize as secular. Under this rubric fall things like the records and accounts of the local Jewish community, dockets from the local Jewish court, business agreements, merchants' inventories, marriage contracts, divorce certificates, and correspondence of all sorts. Such documentary materials, as scholars tend to refer to them, constitute an invaluable source of first-hand information for the social historian. They contain a dizzying array of detailed information about daily life. From them we learn about the kinds of foods people ate, the clothes they wore, what their houses looked like. We hear about the day-to-day challenges of family life and the pressures of work and the struggle to earn a livelihood. There's nothing comparable for any other period of pre-modern Jewish history, and given the lack of archives in the Muslim world before the 16th century, they are of tremendous importance for historians of Islamic civilization as well. There were other kinds of surprises in the geniza, too. Pages from Arabic literary texts, like the beautifully illuminated Kalila wa Dimna that you see here, also show up in the geniza. And even more tantalizing, though perhaps somewhat less visually stunning, are copies of Islamic religious texts. Here we are looking at 2 pages from a copy of the Quran. As some of you may be able to recognize, it's written in Hebrew characters. The language is Arabic, but the script is Hebrew, indicating that it was intended for a Jewish audience. That Jews should have been interested in reading the Quran isn't in and of itself all that surprising. One scholar has plausibly observed that texts such as this would have been used by Jewish authors of anti-Islamic polemical treatises, which indeed exist. That may be, but the fact that a Quran in Hebrew script found its way into a repository ostensibly for sacred Jewish writings might also suggest that someone, at some point, mistook this for a Jewish holy book. Whatever the case may be, the unusually broad application of the practice of Geniza in medieval Fustat presents us with an unparalleled window onto the social, cultural, and religious history of a significant community. As early as the 18th century, European travelers, scholars, and collectors started to take notice of the Geniza, and from time to time, those who made their way to Cairo managed to acquire some of its contents for their own personal libraries. A major turning point came in 1896 when Solomon Schechter, a professor of rabbinics at Cambridge University, was in the midst of a contentious scholarly disagreement, was shown a scrap from the Geniza that clinched the dispute in his favor. With the zeal of the newly converted, Schechter set off for Cairo and in short order had succeeded in procuring all of the remaining manuscripts for Cambridge University's library. Altogether, a staggering 250,000 manuscripts, or close to 750,000 individual pages, were removed from the Geniza and are currently dispersed among some 20 research libraries and private collections in the US and Europe. While manuscript pages were consigned to the Geniza more or less continuously from the 11th century until shortly before Schechter's arrival in Cairo, the lion's share from the material dates from between the years 1000 and 1250, which is often called the classical Geniza period. Here we see a photograph from 1898 of Schechter surrounded by heaps of Geniza manuscripts. It was taken in a special room in the Cambridge University Library that was set aside for sorting the newly acquired materials, a room that one contemporary observer described as the Cairo apartment. This is an extremely famous photograph. Recently, Schechter's pose here has been described as that of a, quote, rabbinic version of Rodin's The Thinker, which I think is really fantastic. But what I want to call your attention to today are the other elements of the picture and the way they form a study in contrasts. On one hand, we are struck by the stateliness and composure of the physical space. The room is grand, spacious, and well-proportioned. It has high ceilings and intricately carved windows. The walls are clean and spare. On the other hand, we can't help but take note of the element of chaos introduced into this scene by the manuscripts. They appear as disheveled and unruly intruders who seem to have infiltrated and thrown into confusion the formerly tranquil setting. This wonderful image is a useful metaphor for the point I really want to stress today, namely the messiness that the Geniza introduced into much of what historians thought they understood about the way religious communities interacted in the medieval Islamic world. The neat and overly simplistic categories that we often fall back upon, the idea that Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived in more or less ghettoized communities, these are complicated in substantial ways by the documents from the Geniza. What follows are a number of illustrations of this theme. My first example actually focuses on contacts between groups within the Jewish community itself, groups that were once thought to be sworn enemies. A major fault line in medieval Jewish society involved the authority of rabbinic tradition, that is, the exegetical interpretations and ritual norms found in the Talmud and other related works. On one side of the divide were those Jews who were loyal to the teachings of the rabbis and who regarded them as the definitive expression of the divine message. We refer to them as rabbinites, and their spiritual errors constitute the overwhelming majority of today's Jews. On the other side of the divide were those who rejected the teachings of the rabbis, viewing them as, at best, unwarranted innovations and at worst as outright distortions of God's intentions. They proclaimed their allegiance to Scripture alone, and it is on this basis that they came to be known as Karaites, or scripturalists. The Karaites' religious stance resulted in a number of significant divergences in the practices of the two communities. Karaites used different methods for the ritual slaughter of meat and rejected the rabbis' inclusion of fowl under the biblical prohibition on eating meat and dairy together.